Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. Glad to have you along again. We just finished John chapter 11 last time. We are going to do the entirety of John 12 this time. I think we can get through the whole thing. We're getting into the Passion Week, talking chronology, just loving the text for itself and following through on what's the most important part of Jesus' life, and that is his last week. Think of that. The last week of Jesus' life out of his whole 30 years. This is the important week to most of the Gospels because of what happens. I wish we would have had the tape running for you, our audience, just before we turned it on, because as is usually the case, Mike and I have our funnest conversations after we turn off the mic, and we compare thoughts and what Mike mentioned, and I'll let you jump in, Mike, here as you want. Let me introduce what you said. It's interesting that of all the church councils, the 7 church councils that have been historically known to be, the councils that set the framework for historic orthodoxy for even the Protestant and Catholic Church, the first 7 church councils, none of them dealt with atonement theory, which gives the sense that gives the question, are we making more of atonement than the early church did, even the first 5-6 centuries of the church? Mm-hmm. Take it from there, Mike. I mean, you made some interesting comments to me, and I think they're worth hearing.
I think it's just an interesting thing because even the way that we've been talking about atonement, we acknowledge there are different aspects, there are different emphases, and during my time at Gordon, that was one of the interesting things that I learned was to realize that none of the ecumenical councils came to ever really focus on about what is atonement. They never came to define it, to make it uniform, and instead understood there are so many verses, there are so many passages that talk about it in one way or another, using metaphors and descriptions. They never tried to define it. And yet, I guess part of my curiosity is, does that allow then atonement to be flexible through the ages and through the generations of the church as we still wait for Jesus to come back, which, by the way, was something that the church councils themselves in their own creeds always kept reiterating. We're still waiting for Jesus to come back, to actually bodily come back. They cared more about that than they actually wanted to define what atonement was or is.
Yeah. And my quick answer as we're talking, and I'll say it again here now, this is where Mike Heiser, proudly wore the kaleidoscopic view because he, and I think this is a good thing, wanted the redemption of man as one through the cross to be as broad as possible. Nothing wrong with that. My argument or my adjustment to Dr. Mike's view would be that the word atonement specifically, kafar in Hebrew, was an aspect of or a subset of the death of Christ. And that discussion can be pulled aside by itself, which I did last podcast on John 11:52. And so the question or the concern of Mike having a more of a kaleidoscopic view, I would agree with. And I would just add now on the issue of atonement, specifically of atonement, I think we can go this way. But your point about the early counts, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, and it's just, and this was part of what we were talking about off camera and I'm not tied to this. It's just a musing that I have right now. It's not fully formed. So please, audience, just this is like a work in progress in my mind. But I do wonder if maybe one of the reasons why atonement was never defined or ever really sought after was because maybe this is meant to be used as some sort of, I hate the word subjective, but
cultural,
some flexible way to help those of us who are part of the family of God, learning about the story of God, to understand how do we become one with this God. And
I totally like that. I really do.
And so that would help explain to me why folks like Anselm would bring up the whole entire, penal substitute, like what eventually would evolve to be penal substitutionary atonement. And it made sense for a time when Europe was going through essentially feudal vassals and lords and everything like that of you have to be punished because there is this debt that you owe. And it made sense for the culture and the time of the people. Just like how many, many centuries ago, it used to be ransom theory, or it used to be somehow this particular atonement theory. And later, then there's the Lord's example atonement theory, and then there are many more. But it drew people in to the story. And now I'm not tied to it, but I'm just wondering.
I like that. And I want to honor it because that's where I grew up too. And maybe you didn't as much as I did, but I prayed that Jesus would forgive my sins as paid for on the cross. That's how I became a Christian, Mike, in 1967, before you were a gleam in your mother's eye. So the idea of debt and payment and accepting the payment of Christ on the cross, things like that, that's part of my DNA. And I grew up with it, and I accepted the Lord on that basis. My point as we jump now into John 12 is that, well, let's put it this way, and bring the crowd back into it. If you want a divine counsel worldview, though, you are limited to the text. Is that fair? That we all have to, we're driven by the worldview to go back and ask, what did the original writer mean to the original reader? And that becomes your basis, and that becomes your conversation, whether or not that heads into Anselm later or the Westminster Confession later and all that kind of stuff. That's fun. That's history. That's theology. And I don't doubt that and don't mind it. But the fun that we're having with the text, I think, is based on asking the question, what did the writer mean when he said it? So we always, at least in this podcast, end up there as best we can.
Yeah, so. and you know, it's not to say that, like, and the reason I just want to be careful is that it's not that I reject any of them. I just wonder, why do we have to become so adamant that only one is correct when the early church never dealt with it as an issue? They were more concerned about the very person, nature of who Jesus is, of just making sure everyone understands, who is he? Can we all come around a way to describe Jesus that we all can agree on? That was more important than atonement theory. And it bothers me that there are certain camps these days that would make an atonement theory higher of importance than, say, the Council of Nicaea.
Right. Fair enough.
That bugs me when I hear of stories of certain camps making, the Trinitarian doctrine, this whole entire stuff of how we got here to this point, not as important as atonement theory. And that bugs me because that was never something. Bugged, Mike.
That's good.
Anyways, yes.
Anyway, let's do it. John 12. Thank you so much. Yeah. And like I was saying, starting this, that I think the best things that happen on our podcast sometimes happen off air. So, oh, well, I'm sure others have the same thing happen. Here we go. John 12. We just ended, of course, the story of Lazarus' resuscitation, and Jesus saying, or the Caiaphas, without knowing it, prophesied that Jesus would die for, prepare the nation, and to gather into one the family of God. So here we go, John 12:1. 6 days before the Passover. Well, there we go, right off the bat. We have to pause and say, okay, what's going on here? And this will help. This really does set up so much of the conversation to go between John 12 and the rest of the book, that I want to pause with that phrase, 6 days before the Passover. We've had 3 Passovers in John's letter, John's book, John 2, John 6, and now. So most commentators take Jesus' ministry to be 3 years long, sandwiched around the 3 Passovers mentioned in John 2, 6, and 12. Okay, so let's start with this. Very quickly, John's chronology of Jesus' Passion Week. John's chronology is difficult because he does not say specifically what day things happen as much as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that's why John's chronology is its own study unto itself. Let's start with John 12:12, where he has a triumphal entry, the triumphal entry, and traditionally that's a Sunday. There is a small band of scholars, Harold Honer at Dallas Seminary when I was there, believed in a Monday triumphal entry, but let's not worry about that. It doesn't make a big difference. For sake of just having a starting point, let's say John 12:12, the triumphal entry, which we're going to get to coming up here in our study today, is Sunday. Okay, if you go to the end of John 20 verse 1, first day of the week, Jesus resurrects. So there is the traditional Passion Week, Sunday to Sunday, John 12:12 to John 20 verse 1. There is your Passion Week. Okay. Now, by looking at John 12:12, when it says the next day, that means the day previous, which is John 12:9, is Saturday. And this will be, as we'll notice, the enemies are arranging for Lazarus' death based on what that's caused, the ruckus that it caused. Okay, so far we've got a Saturday preceding the traditional Passion Week, Sunday to Sunday. Now, it's interesting that in John, you never have mention of the Pascha, the Passover story in the book of John. You have mention of Passover, but it's not in relation to any kind of a meal or the celebratory meal or the celebratory feast. You have to go to Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22, and they're all in total agreement that Jesus, on the last night before his death, or not the last night, but the last Passover, he has a meal with his disciples. So that's only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You have to leave John out of that conversation, specifically in locating the last Passover on Thursday of the Passion Week. And it's not hard to do it. It's just that you can't use John. However, again, going back to John, you do get Friday as the crucifixion based on John 19, verses 14, 31, and 42, where it talks about the preparation day. Preparation for Sabbath is the issue, and Sabbath is going to be Saturday. That means we can nail down in John's gospel that the crucifixion happened on Friday, which is consistent then with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I'm going to keep flying along here, Mike, unless you have any questions. But this is, again, putting together a chronology of John's Passion Week, or the Gospel of John. Okay? Now, here's where we come to today's opening line, John 12:1. 6 days before the Passover. So let's count them. Day 1 would be Wednesday prior to the Thursday Passover. Day 2 would be Tuesday. Day 3 would be, Monday. Day 4 is the Sunday of the triumphal entry. That means day 5 would be the Saturday of John 12:9. And that brings us to day 6, Friday. So we basically are hearing, I'm going to rephrase John 12:1. Friday, 1 week before he died. That's literally what it's saying. 6 days before the Passover, or Friday before he dies. The reason this is so important is because John 13 through 17, a huge, 5 chapters of material, is going to happen between John 12:1, of course, and the Passover, or the death of Christ when he dies. And it's introduced in John 13:1 with, quote, now before the Feast of Passover. So wherever we put John 13 through 17, which I would recommend is hugely important, and I'm going to be following the basic outline of Ben Witherington on how he handles John 13 to 17. And you have to read a lot of different parts of Witherington to put this all together. But he does a wonderful, masterful job, in my mind, of just thinking through the chronology of how this is going to sound or work in John with what it means to the reader. Anything here, Mike, that's, again, I'm showing this to you for the first time, so anything that I should pause and clarify, or are you good?
No, I think generally this is a pretty understandable timeline. I guess I'm actually now more curious about, do I have something from Ben Witherington on the Gospel of John?
Yeah, his again, I've said this, but what I love about Witherington and what I don't love about Witherington is that he writes train of thought. I mean, he just writes, so he'll break off a conversation about something and go into something completely different. It's wonderful stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, how would I have found this if I wasn't just reading along? And then he gets back to the main topic. But so he's a very stream of thought kind of writer, which again, and it's a good stream. I mean, that guy can write. But you'll find it in books that have nothing to do with John 13. That's the problem sometimes. Okay, here we go. Friday, 1 week before he died. Here we go. Jesus therefore came to Bethany. Now on a map, that's just a stone's throw from Jerusalem, just around the corner by, again, where Lazarus was resuscitated, where Lazarus was. So they gave a dinner for him there. Now dinner, let's stop there. Deipnon in Greek. So they come 6 days before the Passover. Let's add this to our little chart here. Friday previous. They have a deipnon for Jesus. They give him a deipnon. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Obviously, we have to ask, what is a deipnon? It's not a common word. If you look it up in the regular BDAG, it's the main meal of the day, a dinner, a supper, a feast. It's just, again, it's very general. It's a whole meal. That's the point. And so even in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul complains in Corinth, each one goes ahead with his own deipnon. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. So whatever's going on in 1 Corinthians 11, it is a full meal in which some are going hungry and some are having too much. Okay. It is interesting, and here's this is important without telling you why. On my computer, I asked, the Greek word for deipnon is the Strong's number 1173, and I asked my computer, does that word, deipnon, ever occur within, and I got up to 1,000 words here, does that ever occur within 1,000 words of the word Passover, or Pascha? You can see where I'm going with this. Is there any relationship between a deipnon meal and a Passover meal? And when I hit enter, I get this little nope screen. There is no time within the canon of the New Testament that the Passover is talked about in at least in terms. And that's true, that you can look up a deipnon then in the story. And Jesus says deipnon numerous times in his parables, the feast that someone's invited to and whatever that parable was. So the word occurs in Jesus' tongue and on Paul's tongue, but it never occurs in a Passover context. You don't have a deipnon when you have a Passover meal. A Passover meal is more specific. It's a ceremonial passing of a loaf and a cup and that kind of a thing. Is that making sense so far? Mm-hmm. I've taken all this time just to say this. A deipnon is not a Passover meal. They are not related. And in Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22, the Passover, the last Passover that Jesus practices, deipnon is not used there either. So just trying to keep those two very, very separate. All right, let's go on. Jesus therefore came to Bethany. They gave him a dinner. Here's again another phrase that catches our attention. Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Remember, in that day you'd lay kind of sideways on your elbow and eat, and so you literally could recline with people at the table. And Lazarus is one of them. He has just been resuscitated, and I'm sure that would have been an interesting guy to meet, to ask, what in the world did you do for those 4 days? Here is where then, as you start to compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John together, which doesn't happen often, here is one of those stories that does occur in the synoptics. In Mark and Matthew, Mark 14 and Matthew 26, you have this story. While Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, so do you see how that tells us there's enough telegraphing in the story that we know we're dealing with the same story. They're in Bethany, the last week of the Lord's life, and they're reclining at a table. And that's where this woman in the Matthew and Mark version, she's unnamed. She does what she'll also do here in the John story. So I just want to make it clear that we are dealing with Mark and Matthew as well. But you have that Simon the leper. Here's where Witherington makes the question, and he even kind of ponders, like you started our podcast here with, you're not going to put any money on it, but is there a possibility that Lazarus was Simon the leper? I mean, Lazarus died of some kind of illness, apparently. Could it be that Simon, how people are multi-named in this time period? Could it be that Simon the leper is Lazarus, or is his father? Because you have 3 unmarried siblings living in the same house, according to the story. Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. And could it be that Simon is the father figure of this otherwise shall we say, unclean house where you have a leper there, or maybe a previous leper. So that's just a theory, but it's interesting that Simon's mentioned by name in Mark 14, and there is no Simon in John 12. Okay? Going on in our John story, Mary, by name, this is the sister of Lazarus, therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. If you've ever seen this on video, it's a messy affair. It's hardly romantic. I mean, it's just gross. It just reeks of, this is not sensible, but it's all symbolic, right? You are in a posture of total obeisance to someone. You're showing them love by doing something that's really, frankly, very, very messy. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, and of course the writer knows who he is, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Going back to Mark 14, the parallel text in the Synoptics. He's unnamed. There it reads, "There were some who said." I think the Matthew one has, "his disciples were indignant," or were uncomfortable, something like that. So only John has the name Judas, compared to the Synoptics who leave the person unnamed. But they say basically the same thing. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? The writer says, knowing the story, he said this not because he cared about the poor, but having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself, stealing. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial." Again, that's very proleptic. Is that the right word? Anachronistic or poignant speech for what's about to happen. "For the poor you always have with you," just a fact, "but you do not always have me." When the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. I just highlight that to say, remember, Lazarus must have been quite the figure of that time and place and geography, because the story of John 11 and now in John 12 is that when Lazarus both dies and now that Lazarus has come back from the dead, it's a popular event. People know about it. This is front page above the fold kind of information. So he's not a by the way kind of person in the story. He's quite famous, I think, in the area of Judea there. And many people come to see him, and we're going to read in just a moment. In fact, here it is. The chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death. I mean, this is serious because he is a walking proof of Jesus. Well, you can't say deity because raising someone from the dead, Elijah's done that. It proves his messiahship or his chosenness or his, uniqueness with the Father for sure. And so they are willing to put Lazarus even to death based on what people are doing. They're believing in Jesus, and they don't like it. So just to be clear on our Passion Week chart again, John 12:1, it's a Friday. We have a meal in Lazarus's and his sister's home. Next thing we hear, we're moving only one day ahead, John 12:9, his enemies arrange for Lazarus's death. Okay? 12:12. If you're ready,
Ron,
go ahead.
You can just hold for a moment.
Yeah.
When you were mentioning about the messy affair, about the anointing itself in the nard, it was sometime last year I actually preached a sermon that was about the anointing. And so one of the things I decided to do to kind of maybe bring some sort of aromatherapy, if you want to call it that way, but a way to actually help people in my congregation kind of maybe mentally visualize what that scene must have been like, was I had bought a little tiny bottle of actually nard and then used one of those kind of perfume sticks, like those little paper samples that you might see in Macy's or something like that, and dipped it into the nard, and we basically place a paper sample at every possible seat in the sanctuary for everyone to come in. And so people were starting to find these little pieces of paper that had the scent of nard on it. And the general consensus was wow, this is very strong. Even just from the little dip of nard on the paper. And so I emphasize, do you not realize that she poured all the contents of that nard on Jesus? And already just from the small amount, you can tell this is a strong aroma. Could you imagine what the house must have smelled like at that moment when that happened? And even one commenter pointed out that smell of nard might have actually still carried through all the way to his actual burial.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. It's only a week away.
Just how intense that was. And I even did a modern calculation of what that nard would have cost in modern currency. And it was over $56,000.
Yikes.
So it was like, can you imagine? This is a family heirloom that she is pouring all of it before Jesus, and thus partly why Jesus pushes back on folks like Judas of like, this is such an incredible waste. It's because this is a once in a lifetime moment. Yeah. The only chance that he would ever have some sort of anointing or, some sort of oil that's placed upon his body, because that's not going to happen when he dies.
Yeah, you're right.
And that this is why what she did to me, as what Jesus says, was beautiful.
Yeah. Boy, it reminds me, and it just happened for a context I'm not going to tell about, but just this, and I'm not saying God talked to me, but I felt him say, as it were, don't worry about the money. Don't worry about the money. In other words, there are numerous times in life we've all faced it where, should I just buy this or spend this or see this money go for this direction, whatever. And I just sensed, you know what? God's saying, don't worry about the money. In other words, here it is. And that's your point, right? I mean, Jesus could very well have said, there's a better use for this money, this nard, and we can give it to the poor and solve a lot of pain, at least for this week, in certain districts in Jerusalem. And he said, basically, don't worry about the money. You are anointing me for my burial, and it's a higher level of meaning at this point. So good point. Yeah. Thank you. John 12:12. The next day, here we go with the traditional, again, view of that this is on a Sunday. It doesn't say Sunday, but we presume it is. The next day, the large crowd heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. They took branches of palm trees and cried out, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So on our chronology chart, John 12:12, Sunday, the triumphal entry. By the way, that Hosanna is right out of the Hebrew Bible. This is a quotation or a part of, the Psalm 118. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. And then on down to, is it verse 25? Save us, we pray. In Hebrew, Hoshea na, now. Save us now comes out Hoshana, Hosanna. And that's what they're simply saying then to Jesus as he comes, quote, in the name of the Lord. And again, that name of is to be, and I'm summarizing BDAG on this, name to be understood as reputation, authority, or delegated power. In this sense, coming in the name has the sense of becoming the possession of, under the protection of the one whose name is invoked. And we are baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit because in the early church, it seems that people would give themselves to the protection of, the possession of the Father, Son, and Spirit even. So it's a fantastic idea. Blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh. Jesus found a young donkey, sat on it, just as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. This, by the way, and I'm going to make a point of this because it frustrates me. Okay, Mike? So if it frustrates me, it must be worth talking about. Did Jesus fulfill Zechariah 9:9, where it talks about the foal of an ass and things like that? Well, if I got on a foal of an ass and walked into Andover, Minnesota, where I live, am I fulfilling Zechariah 9:9? In one sense, I am. In another sense, I'm using a verse on, for my own good. Here's a classic quote from a classic book. I couldn't find it on my shelf, so I had to ask Chat I remember him saying something like this, and Chat said, "Yeah, this is in the book, so I'm going to go with Chat on this one. This is exactly how I remember it. So if I'm wrong, Chat's wrong." But Josh McDowell has in the Old Standard Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the Old Testament contains more than 300 prophecies that were fulfilled in the life of Jesus, from his birth, ministry, and death and resurrection. These predictions, written hundreds of years before, find their precise fulfillment in him. And here was the line I remember him saying: "The odds of this happening by chance are so astronomically high that chance is completely ruled out." Well, the problem is, again, and let me just give you my point. I guess I'm not going to belabor it, but I'm just going to give you my thought. When it comes to fulfilling messianic prophecies, I do believe there are some that are front and center, right? Genesis 49:10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. God is going to work through the Judah family to save his people, to lead his people. Numbers 24:17, same idea. 2 Samuel 7:16, David's throne established forever. Whoever's going to be the Messiah is going to come through David. Psalms 2:45-110, Isaiah 9, Isaiah 53, the role and character of God's chosen one he will be a man acquainted with grief and sorrow. I think that's a prediction of, doesn't say Messiah in Isaiah 53, but I take him to be the Messiah there, and that God's chosen one will have a life that knows sorrow. Daniel 7, very strong, of course, prediction of what the Son of Man will do, and he'll in his receiving of the kingdoms of the world. So, and then the Bethlehem story of Micah 5:2. Let me just give you my concluding thought, and we've talked kind of like this in our Divine Council thinking. I've hearing other Divine Council folk talk, here's where my nervousness lies. So I'm going to kind of show my hand in saying this. My personal recommendation when it comes to fulfilling messianic prophecies: make messianic prophecies difficult to fulfill by honoring the left to right nature of Old Testament narrative and theology building. In other words, Isaiah 7 that talks about a virgin conceiving, let Isaiah 7 tell its story. Don't run to the New Testament too quickly. Let Isaiah 7 unfold in front of Ahab and Isaiah and all this, or Ahaz, is it? And the people that are involved in that story. Let me keep reading. Do not let our New Testament knowledge influence on the front end one's reading of the Old Testament. Here's why. Let the Old Testament writers say what they mean to say to their original audience, and watch that narrative build into the actual life and ministry and role of Jesus. In other words, you're going to get there soon enough. So just let it go. Don't rush to get Jesus into a text when you don't need to so soon. Reading the text, here's my point, reading the text Jewishly, which I recommend means think like them, think like the writer, ends in a Christocentric reading. But it doesn't begin there. So, and again, maybe we've talked, you and I, about this even off air, but should we read the Bible Christologically? Read the Bible and you'll end up being Christological. I have no doubt about that. But my nervousness is when I hear people finding Jesus in every nook and cranny of the Old Testament. It's kind of like, again, hearing the story being told to my grandkids and the storyteller stopping every now and then and telling them how it's going to end before they get there. Mm-hmm. And I want to just say, let the kids listen to the story and they'll get it in time, in due time, and in fact enjoy it more. So that's why, and I just bring this up with the getting on the colt. If I were to do it, am I fulfilling prophecy? No. The fact that Jesus did it, Josh McDowell says, see, that's a fulfillment. And I would say, well, if that's one of your 300, don't do that. Just kind of, make it hard to fulfill. And then it makes more meaning, frankly, for the person who experiences those prophecies. So.
Can I maybe provide a little pushback and maybe a corrective also for McDowell? Because I understand the merits or the heart, the intention of why folks would want to promote Christocentric readings. The one problem with it is just that there's a whole gamut when it comes down to what do you mean when you say Christocentric. Right. What I have been more using often, and the way I try to describe this type of stuff, is I would rather use the term Christotelic, because when I hear Christocentric, especially when then you're talking about New Testament material, what often happens is that I find when people say, oh, we want to do a Christocentric reading, what they really are actually talking about is then treating the New Testament as though, well, it only ever focuses on the cross. and so essentially the Old Testament always looks towards the cross. The New Testament looks back at the cross. And I would say, well, didn't the disciples of Jesus after, they had more of a Christotelic, I thought, because they're actually looking towards his return. They're looking towards
good point.
What is going to happen when the kingdom finally does come and heaven and earth are finally one. And so I would say Christotelic probably makes more sense that we're looking towards. Mm-hmm. For the McDowell quote, I do think that unfortunately, I agree what he means in that it is a fulfilled prophecy. I mean, it makes sense, but I think unfortunately the emphasis is on, well, we got to come up with scientific statistical data to show how weirdly and strangely this thing could be fulfilled, and not actually trying to understand what is Zechariah 9:9 even actually trying to talk about.
Right.
And I didn't use ChatGPT. I'm using the Logos AI.
That's better.
And it popped up that the fulfillment carries profound symbolic weight. The prophecy describes a king who comes righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey. And Jesus' choice of mount deliberately communicated his character. In the ancient Middle Eastern world, leaders rode horses if they rode to war, but donkeys if they came in peace.
In peace, yeah.
Rather than arriving as a military conqueror, Jesus came as the righteous one who offers salvation, not as a conquering military leader, and comes with reconciliation, as did rulers sometimes rode a donkey in times of peace. It's symbolizing, I'm not here to crush or to annihilate the Romans.
Right. So it's not prophetic, it's symbolically telling a story. I mean, it's saying this, I'm doing what Zechariah and other stories of the Old Testament show my character. So, yeah.
I mean, you could, in a way, say prophetically he fulfills it, and that just as it is written, like the way that the writer uses that. But it's to understand, like, do you get it? He came not to kill everyone. He came to offer peace.
Yeah. So thank you. And I guess I'll just summarize what, my burden is that I almost feel like there's sometimes a competition being played out among commentators who can find Jesus more in the Old Testament. And I've stepped away from that game altogether. And I'm saying, just read the Bible and you're going to come up with the same Jesus they have if you read the story left to right. And it'll be, I would even recommend, more fascinating. So John 12:16, his disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified after the resurrection, then they remembered that these things had been written about him. There's your backwards look, or what I call retrospective fulfillment patterns that are going to happen. Like in John 2, we had this, destroy this temple, 3 days I'll raise it up. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples, John 2:22, remembered that he had said this. It's kind of a retrospective. Oh, that's right. He said that, and now I can see how that works. I would even recommend that works into the atonement theory, or the different kinds of atonement theories that are going to develop even within the text of Scripture, like in Hebrews 13, verse 12. When they think about this, again, this is the only time it happens in the Bible, but I find this fascinating. So Jesus suffered outside the gate. Oh, that's right. He didn't die at the temple like a sacrifice. He died out in a cemetery in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp. It's like they're retrospectively fulfilling, okay, he didn't die the way we thought a sacrifice would die. That's okay. Let's go out and have a party in the cemetery with him. So it's just a good example. I think this happens numerous times, that the writers of the New Testament retrospectively find fulfillment that are not even prophetic, shall we say, but they become prophetic in how they're viewed. This is 7-8 years ago now that Mike, Dr. Heiser had his conferences, 2 of them in Dallas. Were you at either one of those? I forget.
No. Actually, the second one. I was at.
And that's where I did this paper. It was called Gentile Lives Matter. I forget if we talked there or met, but I done a paper called Gentile Lives Matter, connecting Old Testament atonement, Jesus' death, and Gentile inclusion. So my whole view of atonement was there in that paper. But this was my opening point about retrospective, and I didn't call it that, but this is what this is. It's called retrospective fulfillment. That in the story of the Bible, you could say it goes Old Testament atonement, then Jesus dies in order, left to right. Now we have Gentile inclusion. That would be the narrative way of describing the this, then this, then this of my view of the effect of Jesus' death on Gentile inclusion. But when you think about the story of the New Testament, Jesus' death actually becomes a discussion after they realize Gentile inclusion is already a thing, right? So that like in John 4, Jesus is trying to tell the woman of Samaria, hey, you're part of the family. If you believe in me, you're in. He doesn't die until John 19. So Jesus' death actually becomes by the way, it's not the cause of Gentile inclusion. Jesus is the cause of Gentile inclusion just by his own teaching. And then like in Acts 10, you have again the story of Peter and Cornelius. And it's not until Ephesians 2 that you actually have the story of Gentile inclusion as a part of atonement theory, right? So it's interesting, again, this retrospective idea can go into various parts of our biblical study, and sometimes things are happening that are already true that become a discussion later in the narrative chronologically of the New Testament. So anyway, John 12:17, the crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to bear witness. And this is right after the triumphal entry into the eastern wall there of the city of Jerusalem. Today, if you go to Jerusalem, that wall is bricked up. Arabs have put a cemetery just outside the wall there to keep Jewish traffic down, shall we say, because it's now Gentile territory in their mind. Anyway, for this reason, the people also met him because they heard he had done this sign. So the Pharisees said to one another, you see that you are gaining nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. Here's the evidence again that this telegraphing the idea that the world now, not just Jews, but the world is going to be benefited by what Jesus is about to do. And in fact, the next verse has this interesting story that's only in John. Now, among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. Now, Greeks, again, would go to the temple. They would not be allowed past a certain area. But there are many. These are called God-fearers in the ancient world. In the Bible, they are those who worship Yahweh from a distance. They want to be part of the Abrahamic family. They're not allowed because of the curse of the law, but they get to be part of the general crowd that assembles in Jerusalem. And Jews like that. They're privileged to have these people there, but of course they don't allow them to cross into family territory, as it were. So these people came to Philip. And as I hear this, if I'm reading the story now, and I've already heard in John 11 that Jesus is going to gather the family through his death. And now I hear that some Greeks are looking for him. I wonder if this is for a reason of talking about Jesus' death. So let's read it that way. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida. You know, Bethsaida is again, there's debate on this, so I don't want to make it too hard, but the idea that this is a road that goes right through Bethsaida that Gentiles would travel on the way between Egypt and Mesopotamia. So that's why it was considered, probably, this is my view, the most Gentile of the cities of Galilee. And asked him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. So Philip knows Greeks when he sees them. They come up to him and say, we're here for temple worship. But really, what we want to do is see this person that they must have heard something about him, a la John 4, that he's the Savior of the world. We wish to see him ourselves. There's something about Jesus that's, shall we say, even these Greeks want to see and talk to. Next line I find interesting. Peter went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. And Jesus answered them. And I paused to say, could it be that when Jesus hears that Greeks want to see him, that he thinks about, well, let's talk about it again. Here's that temple. There's the model. There's that balustrade. The Greeks want to come over that balustrade, but they're not allowed. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Jesus brings up his death when he hears about Greeks wanting to see him. To me, that evidences, again, the purpose of Jesus' death is to bring the Greek, the Gentile, into the family. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, there's his death pictured. It remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. And I think that fruit, again, is the family coming together. Whoever loves his life loses it. Here's Jesus' story in a nutshell. Whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, and I think this line is given to you and I, Mike, this is the kind of thing he wants his people to know, that his death does not mean we're not going to die. It means we're going to die too. We are going to follow him down this path of lifestyle. He must follow me. Where I am, there my servants will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. So many of the disciples, and I don't know the tradition, all but one, John of Patmos, I guess, or Apostle John, I heard from tradition, die martyrs' deaths because they follow Jesus' footsteps into this world of pain and even death for what they believe. Yeah. Now my soul is troubled. It's interesting that John, the gospel, does not have a Gethsemane story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a Garden of Gethsemane, period of Jesus talking to the Father and praying. That's going to be missing in John's gospel. That idea has been moved up to this moment, just after the triumphal entry, where he says, my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. And then he makes that classic statement again that I think is resolute, but also laden with a lot of emotion. But for this purpose, I have come to this hour. I think, again, 30 years of being totally sinless and doing everything proper, he is stunned. Jesus himself is stunned that his end is going to be so painful when he has done nothing to deserve that. I'm talking just as a human. He must have felt that. And then, of course, the garden scene shows that he sweat, as it were, great drops of blood. So we need not take away from the humanness of Jesus in this kind of a statement. I want to say, save me, but I'm realizing this is why I have come. So, Father, glorify your name. And a voice came from heaven. This is very rare in the Bible. A voice booming out of heaven. I have glorified it. I will glorify it again. The crowd that heard it said it had thundered. I wonder what that really sounded like. Others said a divine being, angelos, has spoken to him. Angels, again, are not sweet, cherubim-like, arrow-shooting, little doll-faced beings. They're freakish. In the Bible, they're the kind of things that make Daniel in, is it Daniel 10, get paralyzed. I mean, they're freakish-looking things that, and freakish sounding, I guess, even here, where thunder is equated to a angelos. So these are gods who have the purpose of messaging a message. The audible voices from heaven, by the way, like I said, it's rare. This is the third of three instances where the Father breaks protocol and talks from heaven about Jesus. The first is in the baptism. The second, that's Matthew 3. The second is the transfiguration, Matthew 17. You do have Jesus talking to Saul in Acts 9, and going all the way back to Deuteronomy 4, Moses is told by God, when you heard the sound of words, probably referring to Exodus 24, you didn't see a form, so there must have been some kind of voice coming out of something. I'm not sure how that worked in Deuteronomy 4, but we're probably referring back to Exodus 24. My point is that if we think that our God, Yahweh, is in the habit of talking from heaven, no, he isn't. He does it a handful of times, and three of the three. I'm sorry, maybe three of the four. Yeah, it depends how we take Exodus 24. It's about Jesus and my son and his love for his son. So it's a special moment in the history of the world that God would break protocol and boom from heaven. And it's in the context of his death. He is wanting to encourage Jesus that he is not, and by the way, and I've said this, Mike, maybe here, if there's any doctrine that annoys me and just grates on me, it's that when Jesus dies, the Father turns his back on his Son. I think that is the most despicable idea, to give any audience that God would turn his back on Jesus because he's, quote, bearing the sins of the world, or whatever people say in relation to that. That's in hymns. That's not in the Bible. And to have a God that would turn from his Son because he's being obedient unto death, I don't know where we get that. Well, I kind of do. But I find it just horrific theology that we would have Yahweh turning his back on his Son. So,
well, it was years ago. I remember it was during one of my last classes in Hebrew. We talked about, the line where Jesus says from the Psalms, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani.
Oh yeah, Psalm 22.
Right?
Yeah.
And how so many, like I've heard it in my old churches too, and about how, this is the moment where the Father turns his back upon Jesus, that somehow in the great understanding of the Trinity, that somehow we have a brokenness in the Trinity for some reason in this moment, which was like, but wait, what?
Yeah, I know.
Which that's actually what bugged me a bit. I was like, wait, did the early church ever talk about it this way?
No.
I don't think they did.
I think it's an interesting story, but it's based on a theology that God can't be around sin, ...
Yeah.
And you go down that storyline of God can't be around sin, which that's not true. He has Satan in his courtroom in Job 1. Yeah. I mean, even as a kid, I figured this out. That's why it's so frustrating. I'll hear preachers say it, and I'll think, wait a second. The kids in the room know you're wrong. So just don't go down that cliche too far, because you're going to lose them. And you've already lost me if you're going to put that into your story of how Yahweh and the Father, the Father and the Son get along. I just. So let's let it go.
Why I brought it up is because my professor, to his great credit, he pointed out, this is probably a moment where we're actually, his theory is that Jesus actually had memorized the Psalms. And that the moment we hear him say those words, my God, why have you forsaken me? That probably this is just more of a, what was he talking about at that moment? And that he was probably actually reciting that particular psalm. And then let's look at what that psalm goes into.
Oh, that's a good psalm too. Yeah, it ends in great faith. Yeah. And
it goes into basically about how the bulls of Bashan surround me. And so like he didn't go down the route of, this is where the Father turns his back, but actually understanding that contextually Jesus is praying this psalm, and he's thinking of the darkness that is around him, of the malintent of all those who want him to be dead. Mm-hmm. And that he's bringing up this psalm because this is how he feels. And that he's feeling this sense of despair and of darkness that is all surrounding him, just like David, the writer of that psalm, was talking about. And so anyways, like I actually did preach a sermon on this, and I think it really challenged some folks of just how, we always were taught that this is what this quote meant. It's like, no, this is actually quoting a psalm. When was the last time we ever sang and even studied this psalm? Right. Well, we should take a look at it. And that was what my sermon was on about. It was how Jesus, being in this moment, is surrounded by utter darkness. And he's expressing this deep despair of what is going on.
Yeah, we can't minimize the despair of what he was feeling, I would say. Yeah. Thank you. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. This is going to be, again, one of those things, we'd call it retrospective. Oh, yeah. The ruler of this world is coming, John 14. This is going to be the kind of conversation you'll hear later. John 16:11. The ruler of this world is judged. Jesus is admitting a Deuteronomy 32 worldview in which God has given authority to other created divine beings, one of which has by the time of Jesus' day, it's not really clear in the Old Testament, but it is by the New Testament, that there is a being who is in charge of this rebellion, known by the devil or the Satan. And he's called the ruler of this world by Jesus himself, which shows, again, you can't deny Deuteronomy 32 on Jesus' own lips. That's a fascinating idea. Colossians 2, Paul will later, again, looking back, how this works we don't know, but he'll say Jesus disarmed the rulers and the authorities and put them to open shame at the cross. How that works, we're not sure. Paul never gets into that, but he says by triumphing over them in him. Somehow the cross will be the great reversal of the power shift, or the great power shift that God predicted in Daniel 7 officially takes place at the cross and the resurrection. But again, Jesus is playing this out in front of those who need to know it even before he dies. Colossians 1:13, God has delivered us from the domain of darkness. Hebrews 2, this is probably the most clear to me. Through death, Jesus might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil. Does God give the devil a power of death? Well, in some sense, it's admitted here. We're not sure, again, how it works, and I would argue that anyone who dies, God has to still make, the ultimate judgment on that, who dies and who lives. But that's how it's played out here. And deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery of that fear of death. Very clearly seeing the death of Jesus as something that changes the power structure in the heavens. John 12:32, Jesus continues, and I, when I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. It's just a general statement that that's going to be the way that God's people will find me, is by being lifted up and in death. And that's how they understood him. He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. The people answered him, we have heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. By what he means there, by the way, is this messianic understanding that once David's throne is established, it'll never die. So it's probably what they're getting in their head is, wait a second, you're talking about dying. From what we know, the messianic promise, if you claim to be the Messiah, is one of eternal rule. So how can you speak of dying? How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man, or who are you even? You could translate that as. Then Jesus said to them, a little while longer, the light is with you. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. Imagine again living in that day when you're literally days away from the death of the Messiah. The one who walks in the darkness does not know where he is going. While you have the light, and I'm him, believe in the light that you may become sons of light. Oh, we could spend time there, Mike. There is your theosis idea, right? Mm-hmm. That you may become sons of light. The idea that it's the light darkness picture that the Dead Sea Scrolls are known for, showing, and I think he's getting into the whole concept of being changed at the regeneration. Jesus then departed and hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe or show loyalty in or to him. So that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Again, this retrospective fulfillment. Oh, so that's what Isaiah meant when he said, Lord, who has believed what he heard from us, and to whom has the arm or the strength of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe. And the could not again means, well, we have a prophecy that they wouldn't, and that's why retrospectively we're going to say they couldn't. For again Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah said these things, verse 41, because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Again, I don't think we have to say that he saw Jesus, but he certainly saw his glory, or the idea of the Messiah to come, and he speaks of him in Isaiah 9, and maybe in 7 in some sense, and certainly in 53, and the prophecies of later Isaiah often have the ruler and the Messiah, not Messiah by name, but the concept of the chosen one that will be given the rule of the whole earth. Yet many even of the authorities believed in him. Again, a good sign there, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it as to not be put out of the synagogue, which in their world, again, culturally meant you're an outsider looking in from the outside, noses pressed up against the glass of the Abrahamic family. That's what it would mean if you believed for some reason they had made it a rule. You cannot put Jesus as the Messiah. For they loved the glory that comes from man. In Greek, you have the article from the men, but it's a proverbial truism, shall we say, that comes from man more than the glory from, there you have article as well, the God. And so that's just phrased in a way to say they wanted, of the two options to go by, either man or God. And let me make a quick point there, because I remember making this argument back in my dissertation days. Biblical cosmology was two-tiered. And again, a divine council worldview, we've talked about this enough that people won't be surprised. But here are the verses to defend it in case you're trying to amass verses for your defense on this. Believing that if a being was not a human, he was a divine being. There's no angels in between God and man. In other words, you have either you're an Elohim or you're a Adam. This cosmology toggles back and forth. And that's why a lot of verses in the Bible, when you start looking for it, Elohim is not Adam, nor a son of Adam. So it's you're either Elohim or Adam. And so there we go with all these. You're not one, you're the other. Psalm 56:11, in Elohim I have put my trust. What can Adam do to me? I like the Daniel 3:25 one. I see four, now this is Aramaic, so it's going to be a little different. I see four guvrim, he means humans, walking unbound. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the Elohim. Now, he's not versed in Israelite theology. He's not trying to teach, theology about a divine council. He's just saying, I see four humans, but one of them looks like classified as an Elohim. And he didn't have any other word for it. It's like, whatever that is, it ain't human. And so he uses Elohim or Elohim in Hebrew as a way of saying not human, right? So Acts 12:22, the voice of a theos and not an anthropos. It's either one or the other. You're either a theos or an anthropos. Jesus, and that's why in the hymn that you don't want to get too much theological precision out of. And I'm having to be careful here because, again, I want to make Philippians 2 as vibrant of theology as I can, but listen to how it goes. Jesus being in the form of a theos, coming in the likeness of anthropos. He's just saying he went from one to the other, and he's not trying to get into careful, it's a hymn, so it's probably set to a tune, and give the poet license to talk in these kind of poetic terms of, well, if you're not theos, you're anthropos, and if you're not a theos or not an anthropos, you're a theos. So it's just helpful to see how the Bible talks. By the way, and here's where, this is one of the fun disagreements that me and Mike had, Dr. Heiser, is what the Witch of Endor saw. You remember? She screams. Mm-hmm. And Saul said, what do you see? And the woman said, I see an Elohim coming up out of the earth. Well, again, is that a theological statement about who Samuel is as a ghost or what? I just sense, and I often said this to Mike, to me, this isn't a theological statement. It's just, I see something that ain't human. Whatever it is, it scared the bejeebers out of me. And the only word she had for scared the bejeebers would be Elohim. And then she's told later it's Samuel. She didn't know it was Samuel. All she saw was something that was quite scary. So can you get theology out of that? I don't know.
Well, to be fair, if I remember, the way that Mike had described it was that Samuel at that point, because he wasn't alive.
Well, she doesn't know it's Samuel, though.
It's true. She doesn't know it's Samuel, but the way that she's describing, because however he looked like, it did not look like a regular human body. And
I know. That's right. And the only word she had for it was Elohim.
Yeah, and I think that's what Mike was trying to get at, was that there's a very clear distinction. I see you, Ron. You're obviously in a human body.
Yeah.
And you look at me, obviously I look like a human body. But whatever she saw didn't. And so, and later, and of course, the audience is told even before in that chapter, by the way, just to remind everyone, Samuel's dead. Right. And so So we
Now,
get
can
that
we say
sense.
from this that we theologize and say that when you die, you become an Elohim? I'd say that's probably quicker than I would want to go theologically on that, but it's a possibility. It's just a question. And this is, again, this is the kind of thing where Mike and I would stare at the ceiling during ETS and talk into the night on these kind of things as to how much you can get out of each verse. But the point being here is back to it. They love the glory of this world more than the glory from that world. And there is your non-believer problem again. They are not believers in Yahweh. They're not loyalists. They have given up on God, and they have decided to, this is a good example of how the devil works even with the Divine Council worldview. You don't have to be an open believer in other Elohim to be a disbeliever in Yahweh. You can just give your life to boat, money, cars, sex, whatever. And here's a verse that would classify you as a person who wants the glory of anthropoi more than the glory of theos. And it's a dangerous world to live in, because that is not what a Yahwist would do. And Jesus cried out and said, "Whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me." Again, this, there we go. Let's go back to it. He's not saying you don't believe. Again, this is just a proverbial way of saying there is a higher power behind what I'm doing here, or an order of operations where I'm being sent. And so you need to believe in the sender as well as just in me. Whoever sees me sees him who sent me. Now, that's a pretty blanket statement, but again, are we saying, well, let's just leave it for debate within DCW people as to how that works. As you know, there's difference of opinion, and that's good. This is the kind of thing that should cause discussion as to how Jesus and Yahweh relate, Jesus and the Father, when it comes to seeing one and not seeing the other. I don't know if Dr. Mike, I know that Daniel McClellan was referenced by Dr. Mike in his Naked Bible podcast and things. He has the reason I show this is you can get this for free. This is his dissertation. Daniel McClellan is a popular podcaster today, spends a lot of time on social media. And I would recommend his works. I don't believe everything he says. Again, I don't believe everything anybody says. Just understand that you can recommend people without having to get classified with everything they say. So, but I did find this PhD dissertation very helpful, and it's free online. So just look for it, a PDF version. And his point, the reason I bring this up is his point is that this divine image idea, which the DCW knows much about, to him, McClellan answers this question here. Whoever sees me sees him who sent me. That as a divine image of Yahweh, this is a way of talking where you see Baal because you see his image. And it doesn't mean that Baal's in the image. It means that he represents him to the degree that you can see the one who sent him. Something like that. So, if anyone hears my words, Jesus is finishing up here, does not keep them, I do not judge him. Now, what he's going after is something that's not better than him, but something that has existed, shall we say, apart from him. And let's listen to him describe that. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. My role is to save the Gentile. That's why I'm here, of course, to save everyone in so doing, but I'm here to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not receive my words has a judge. Okay, so who is that judge? The word that I have spoken will judge him. Everything I've said, you can kill me, and you still got the problem of what I have said on tape. From the Father. I have not spoken on my own authority. Everything I've said is coming directly from the Father, but the Father who sent me has given me a commandment, what to say and what to speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life, but I say, therefore, I say, as the Father has told me. I think you could argue as we close John 12 that, and I like to say it this way, I think, again, you can use a symbol here that has its weaknesses somewhere, but when Jesus' mouth moves, you're hearing Yahweh talk. However you want to define the Trinity, and again, it's always difficult to put it into clear English words. But I like to use the symbol or the word picture of Jesus. Kind of, I don't know how you do this, but do you see my mouth moving? Every time it moves, you're hearing Yahweh. That's the Father is talking through me. I guarantee it. John 8:29. Everything I do pleases him. And there's the faithfulness of Jesus that's going to be played out in the epistles of Paul and such, that the faithfulness of Jesus to the Father is our goal as well. It's something that we can live for and by as well. So, well, we got through 50 verses. Next time we'll get into John 13, and I bring it up, the reason I started this way with the story of or the chronology of the Passion Week. When you move now to John 13, you're going to have to decide, how does that story of John 13 through 17, because it seems to be one complete or what do you want to call it, undivided piece of literature in the story that's only in John. The four Gospels, the three synoptics don't have this. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to, we all have to place that John 13 to 17 somewhere in the story of Jesus' life. And that's why I went through the time I did on the chronology of John, so that next time when we fit John 13 into the story, you'll see why I do what I do. Okay. Anything as we wrap up, Mike, that we can finish with?
No, I think I didn't realize we covered over 50 verses. Like, holy cow.
We kept flying along.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Questions.dcwp@gmail.com. If you have them, and they are growing by the day, Mike says, so thank you. We take them seriously, and it's our only chance really to shall we say, be interviewed by you, the listener, and respond. So please feel free to send us your comments and questions. We'll certainly put them into QA form as we go. All right. Thank you, Mike, again, for the privilege of talking with you like this. And what a joy to just review the words of our Savior and what they meant when they were said. I can't imagine the emotion of the moment when Jesus knows he's about to die or within days of his death. And that's how we have to take on these words. So, thank you, everyone. Until we meet again, have a blessed day.